Livy, Polybius, Cato the Elder, and the Gracchi brothers. The early Romans, the kind of lives that our ancestors lived. Livy, also known as Titus Livius, was born in 59 BCE at Padua, or Patavium, in northern Italy, and died in CE 17. Little else, however, is known about his life, other than that he came to Rome when about 30 years old, and spent the next 40 years composing his great history of the Roman Republic, entitled Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city. Published in his installments, it covered a vast scope of over 700 years, from the founding of Rome to about 9 CE. In 142 books, the equivalent, it is estimated, of 8,000 printed pages. Only 1/4, however, of this enormous work has survived entirely to our present day. Books 1 through 10, from 753 to 293 BCE, and books 21 and on, from 218 to 167 BCE. Livy was not a critical historian, however. He did not possess the tools used by modern historians in selecting and evaluating sources, not to mention how that he analyzed them. He did, however, select what served his purpose, which was to tell an inspiring story, how the heroic citizens of a small city-state overcame many adversaries in order to become masters of the entire world. His history is a noble prose epic. It is comparable to the Aeneid of Virgil, his contemporary, as a glorification of Rome. And so, Livy's history, a literary masterpiece, became an instant success, and no Roman ever attempted to improve upon it, and earlier histories disappeared. Livy's personal fame soon extended to the borders of the empire. "Have you never heard the story of the man from Cadiz?" asked Tacitus, who has so impressed by the name and reputation of Titus Livius that he journeyed from the end of the inhabited world just to see him, turned about, and went back home. And of course, this quote is from Arnold Toynbee in Civilization on Trial. Livy's account of early Roman history, books 1 through 5, is a story told in great detail, and it is based on what appears to be exact knowledge. In reality, however, early Roman history contains more legend than actual fact, although the legends quite likely preserve a kernel of truth. In his preface, Livy acknowledges the legendary character of the early stories, and he defends their inclusion. He said that there is no reason, I feel, to object when antiquity draws no hard line between the human and the supernatural. It adds dignity to the past. End quote. Livy began his history or inquiry soon after the Republic had fallen, the result, he believed, of the collapse of moral character, hence his emphasis upon the dignity of the past. The way to improve people's character is through the study of history. And Augustus, whose permanent dictatorship replaced the fallen republic, was also concerned with moral regeneration, but through the force of legislation and propaganda. Livy is too steeped in the republican tradition of freedom to favor completely Augustus's program, although he continued to enjoy the dictator's friendship. His brief reference in the preface to Augustus's authoritarian solution quotes that the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them, is followed immediately by his own preferred solution for Rome's ills. The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind. Rome was ruled by kings from its traditional founding by the legendary Romulus in 753 BCE until 509, when an oligarchic revolution ended monarchy and established the Republic. Romulus's 6 successors are considered to have been historical figures. Of course, as you know, Rome was a very primitive kingdom before it became a republic. The ethnic makeup of the Roman people is reflected in the fact that some of these kings were Latin, others from different ethnical descent. Of course, we know that many of them were Etruscans and came from the Etruscan culture. And after Rome was conquered by the Etruscans, of course, around 600 BCE, they were Etruscan. The Roman kings were typical primitive monarchs whose power was limited by an advisory council of their fellow nobles, also known as the Senate, which resisted any attempt by the kings to act arbitrarily. Livy reports, Senate, which resisted any attempt by the kings to act arbitrarily. Livy reports also that Tarquin, or Livius Tarquinius, the last Etruscan king of Rome, was the first king to break the established tradition of consulting the Senate on all matters of public business, and to govern by the mere authority of himself and his household. For this reason he was called the Proud, Tarquinius the Proud, though at first none dared more than to whisper it. We could also compare the Sumerian nobles, who were gloomy in their chambers because Gilgamesh's arrogance was unbridled. And for example, the opposition to King Agamemnon steeped in insolence in Homer's Iliad. But the following account, if you were to read Tarquin the Proud and his arrogant and tyrannical behavior, of the sufferings of the commons condemned to labor underground, clearing and constructing ditches and sewers, we see the Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Ditch, which was built by Tarquin in order to drain the swampy land that then became the Roman Forum, that still forms part of modern Rome's drainage system today. In 509 BCE, the Roman nobles expelled Tarquin the Proud and abolished the monarchy. Even the name that they gave to their new oligarchic government, Res Publica, or Republic, or Commonwealth, seems to have been adopted for propagandistic reasons. The new Roman Republic had not seen the last of Tarquin the Proud. Roman tradition holds that he made several attempts to regain his throne, the last with the aid of Lars Porsena, the Etruscan king of Colosseum. The oligarchic revolution at Rome was the first of a series that would eventually end monarchy in all the Etruscan city-states, and Porsena no doubt feared for his own throne. Modern historians, however, believe that about 506 BCE, Porsena did conquer Rome and hold it for a very short time, but Roman patriotic tradition pretended that his attack was foiled by the heroic efforts of a single Roman soldier, Horatius, one man against an army. Livy reports this tradition, and it is a good example of the many vivid, dramatic stories that he tells to exemplify the virtues of the early Romans for the edification and enjoyment of his readers. Livy's continual emphasis on the national character of what he called the greatest nation in the world should sound familiar to most modern Americans today. The national character of our own country has been a favorite subject of presidents and of politicians who over the years have untiringly instructed the nation and the world globally about the American work ethic, American know-how, and American values. Before jumping to Polybius, I do want to talk about the foreign policy of the Roman Republic concerning Livy. Livy said that one people in the world which would fight for others' liberties. He immediately following the victory over Hannibal in the year 201 BCE, you will remember the Battle of Zama, which occurred in northern Africa in 202 BCE, which ended the Second Punic War and left the Roman Republic the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The Romans were drawn into the maelstrom of Eastern Mediterranean politics. By 189 BCE, Rome had fought and defended in turn the two most powerful Hellenistic states, that of Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, thereby becoming the virtual master of the entire Mediterranean area. The following selection that we might read from Livy's History of Rome is written in the reign of Augustus, which supports the view held by many present-day historians that Rome's initial intervention in the East, like its expansion in the West, was motivated by fear rather than expansion. And during the dark days of the Second Punic War following Rome's defeat at Cannae, Philip V of Macedon, believing that Rome's earlier establishment of a naval base in the Adriatic Sea to deal with pirates was a prelude only to the expansion in the Balkans and a threat to his kingdom, allied himself with Hannibal. However, clashes with the Greeks kept him from aiding Hannibal, and after the war, following an agreement with the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III to partition the outlying possessions of the declining Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, he began advancing in the Aegean Sea region. The small states of Pergamum and Rhodes, already at war with Philip, asked Rome's aid in preserving the balance of power in the east, and the Senate decided to act. Philip's refusal to heed a Roman ultimatum was followed by a declaration of war, but only after the Senate had overcome the initial refusal of the popular assembly in order to approve another war only 1 year after the end of the Great War with Hannibal. Supported by some Greek allies, notably the Aetolian League and that of Athens, the Roman commander Quintius Flaminius routed the Macedonian army in 197 BCE. Rome's lenient peace terms were designed to end Philip's dreams of empire while preserving his state as a buffer against barbarians to the north and Antiochus III to the east. The decision to end Macedon's long-standing attempt to dominate Greece, together with the Philhellene sentiments of Flaminius and other leading Romans, led to the theatrical announcement of the freedom of Greece and the withdrawal of Roman forces. The delirious enthusiasm that this declaration evoked among the Greeks was quickly undermined, however, by misunderstandings between the liberators and the liberated. In time, the paternalistic attitude of the Romans convinced most Greeks that the Romans were still semi-barbarians, or non-Greek speaking peoples, and the Romans in turn lost their early idealism. In 146 BCE, the same year in which they razed the city of Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War, the exasperated Romans completely destroyed the city of Corinth, a hotbed of anti-Romanism, and placed all of Greece under the administrative authority of the Roman governor of Macedonia, which had been annexed 2 years earlier. Livius' report is that the liberated Greeks had eulogized the Romans as one people in the world which would fight for others' liberties at its own cost, ready to cross the sea that there might be no unjust empire anywhere. And this reminds us of Pericles and his defense of Athenian imperialism more than 2 centuries earlier. We are alone among mankind in doing men benefits, in the fearless confidence of bringing freedom. In our own day, when President John F. Kennedy, for example, faced by communist aggression in Vietnam, stirred Americans by announcing, "We in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than by choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom." And of course, this was followed by President LBJ in the same vein. "We did not choose to be a guardian at this gate, but there is no one else." The United States was playing a similar role more than 20 centuries later. And then we will go and speak about Polybius. The Constitution of the Roman Republic. Polybius is one of my favorite writers. He said that it is impossible to find a better than the Constitution of the Roman Republic. Second only to Thucydides among Greek historians was Polybius, who lived around 200 to 117 BCE. He witnessed and speculated upon the events that marked the expansion of Rome in the Mediterranean area from Spain to Asia Minor, and he also grasped the fact that Hellenistic history was passing over into Roman history. He spent 16 years in Rome as one of 1,000 Greek hostages brought to Rome in 167 BCE in order to ensure the good behavior of their compatriots at home. Here, he became a firm admirer of the character and the political and social institutions of his Roman captors. Above all, he became convinced that the expansion of Rome was natural and inevitable, and he undertook to write a history of his own times in order to reconcile the Greek world to the reality of Roman domination. He chose the year 220 BCE as his starting point, the year in which a Roman envoy saved Egypt from an invading Seleucid king by drawing a circle around him in the sand and telling him to order a retreat before he stepped out of it, because, as he put it, Since that time, history had been a kind of organic whole, and since the affairs of Italy and Africa have been interconnected with those of Asia and Greece, all moving toward one end, the Roman world state. He closed his history with the events of 146 BCE, the year in which the Third Punic War was ended with the complete destruction of Carthage, and the year in which the final step in the subjugation of Greece and Macedonia was signaled by an equally ruthless destruction of Corinth. Polybius was particularly interested in discovering causes and in seeing the interrelation of events, without which history is but a rope of sand with no meaning or value. He said that neither the writer nor the reader of history, therefore, should confine his attention to a bare statement of facts. For if you take from history all explanation of cause, principle, and motive, and of the adaptation of the means to the end, what is left is a mere panorama, without being instructive, and though it may please for the moment, has no abiding value." End quote. He is known for attributing Rome's rise to the superior qualities of its citizens and its character, as well as the perfection of its institutions, all of which he contrasted with those of other peoples in the Mediterranean area, and his famous description of the Roman constitution at the end of the 3rd century BCE is a case in point. Influenced by Aristotle, he divided good governments into 3 types: that of kingship, aristocracy, and democracy. And he also attributed the excellence of the Roman constitution to the fact that it contained elements of these 3 types in equilibrium. His emphasis upon the checks and balances of the Roman constitution influenced 18th century French political thinkers in the Enlightenment, and through them entered into the American Constitution as well. The next specimen and person that we will analyze is Cato the Elder, and talking about traditional standards in a new age. The Romans of the early Republic attributed their military successes along with the stability of their whole society to the qualities of character instilled in them by the mos majorum, their ancestral way of life that subordinated the individual to the religious and the social traditions of family, state, and gods. Yet, ironically, it was continued military success that did much to destroy the hold of the mos majorum. As one crisis followed another and Rome expanded outside Italy, given its administrative and militaristic powers of the state, new situations arose that required a new type of leadership that could only come from self-confident individuals who did not feel tightly bound by tradition. The career of Scipio Africanus from around 236 to 183 BCE illustrates the emergence of this new type of highly individualistic leader. In the darkest days of Roman defeats inflicted by Hannibal in the Second Punic War, Scipio Africanus arose to shatter all precedents of caution and restraint, and while often acting contrary to the orders of the Senate, turned the tide of war against the Carthaginians. Conservatives like Cato the Elder, who lived from around 234 to 149 BCE, were keenly aware that such individualism was a challenge to the old Roman traditions, and they also retaliated later by accusing and convincing Scipio on trumped-up charges of irregularities in military expenditures. Scipio scornfully refused to defend himself and chose to remain in voluntary exile from his thankless city for the remainder of his life. It is significant that Scipio was also one of the earliest Romans that was to embrace enthusiastically the study of Greek literature. This contributed, however, to the suspicion held by his conservative opponents that Greek thought was subversive of the established order. Did not much Greek literature celebrate a romantic individualism that rejected all standards of truth and action? Did not the Hellenistic philosophies, with their emphasis on reason and individual happiness, undermine the traditional subordination of the individual to family, state, and gods? It is no wonder that strenuous attempts were made by Roman conservatives, led by Cato, to prevent the advance of Greek culture. In 181 BCE, the Senate ordered the public burning of a treatise on Pythagorean philosophy. Again, in 173 BCE, 2 Epicurean philosophers were ordered out of Rome and a more general decree 12 years later expelled all Greek teachers and philosophers. But all such efforts were futile, and by the end of the 2nd century, the cosmopolitan culture of Greece had absorbed and transformed the ancestral Roman way of life. In Horace's well-known line, quote, "Captive Greece captured in turn her untutored conqueror," end quote. The following selection that we might read from Plutarch's Life of Marcus Cato illustrates two main reasons for Cato's claim to fame: his personification of early Roman character and his leadership in the struggle against Greek learning. He fought hard for an old ideal that he realized was fast slipping away, and in one of his last speeches he finally and sadly acknowledged that his cause was lost. "It is hard," he said, "to have to give an account of your life to men of another age than that in which you have lived." Very, very sad. Next, we will talk about the two Tiberius brothers. First, we will mention Tiberius Gracchus and the new Roman deal. It is an ironic but outstanding lesson of history that the Roman constitution of the middle of the 2nd century BCE, respectively, whose stability and permanence seemed to be so apparent to Polybius, was soon to weaken and collapse. Again, we're getting this from Plutarch's Parallel Lives concerning Tiberius Gracchus. Polybius's verdict on the history of the Greek states that, quote, why they still thought themselves prosperous and likely to remain so, they found themselves involved in circumstances completely the reverse. And this applies equally well to the last century of the Roman Republic, from 133 to 31 BCE. The 100 years preceding 31 BCE witnessed great changes not only in Rome's political institutions, but, in fact, in every other important aspect of Roman civilization as well. Historians, or modern historians, have aptly named the period of the Roman Revolution. We have aptly named the period the Roman Revolution, from 133 to 31 BCE of the Roman Republic, whose poetry celebrated the old traditions and the forces that destroyed the old ways came out of the new environment produced by Rome's expansion in the Mediterranean area. The political, economic, social, and cultural ideas and institutions, which had served well a small city-state, underwent a radical change when Rome emerged as a world power at this time. The impact of the new forces that were destined to change Roman civilization was manifested in politics for the first time during the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BCE. Tiberius Gracchus was a young aristocrat in whom the influence of the liberal learning of Greece, newly imported and popular in the best educated circles of Roman higher society, combined with an awareness that the old Roman way of life was fast slipping away, and inspired him to become a reformer. He proposed an agrarian reform law aimed at solving all the problems that had arisen out of the new environment created by Rome's expansion. He then hoped to recapture the traditional Roman ways by restoring the old environment that had originally produced them, and by breaking up the newly formed large estates worked by a slave labor force plentifully provided by Roman wars. He would then reverse the trend of events that had brought troubles to the Roman state. The dangerous and still growing proletariat of the city would be dispersed to become again a middle class of small landowners. The old Roman morale and traditional values would reappear. A citizen army of sturdy men would be possible as of old, and a stable foundation for democratic government would be provided. In his hopes for these beneficial results of land reform, Tiberius Gracchus reflected a traditional Roman viewpoint. A generation earlier, Marcus Cato the Elder had written of the old Romans that, quote, when they praised a man as good, they called him a good farmer and a good tiller of the soil. And he had instilled that from among the tillers of the soil both the strongest men and the most efficient soldiers come, and that way of gaining a livelihood carries with it, beyond all others, fidelity to gods and men, and stability and freedom from envy, and those occupied in it are least liable to evil thoughts. The opposition to Tiberius's agrarian law centered in the Senate, not only because its members constituted the great landowning class whose economic interests were threatened, but above all because the political supremacy of that body was challenged by the tactics
used by the reformer. Since the passage of the Hortensian Law in 287 BCE, Rome had been a democracy with an unwritten constitution of checks and balances, which had aroused the admiration of Polybius. But Polybius had failed to notice that in the unsettled period following the passage of the Hortensian Law of 287 BCE, Rome had in fact remained an oligarchy in which the senatorial nobility continued to rule. And during these critical years, Rome had fought the Punic Wars and expanded in Italy and the Mediterranean, and the Roman populace willingly allowed the Senate, composed largely of experienced former magistrates, to take over all administrative power and legislative authority. When Tiberius Gracchus revived the democratic power of the popular assembly in order to bypass his opposition in the Senate, the supremacy of the senatorial oligarchy was threatened. In the ensuing struggle, it is difficult to determine the degree of guilt or innocence of the rival factions, for both resorted to illegal or what is considered ill-considered measures, but certainly the use of violence by the senatorial faction was the great error that ultimately reaped the whirlwind of civil war and led to the fall of the Republic. Yet the lesson found here was, or has rarely been, learned, and history is filled with similar instances and patterns in which men blinded by fear and hate have unwittingly destroyed that which they sought to preserve. It was the head of the Roman state religion, the Pontifex Maximus, Nasica, who incited the mob to kill Tiberius Gracchus and his followers, and he did so with a cry that marks the epitome of misguided patriotism, when he said, "Let those who would save our country follow me." The selections that follow are from Plutarch's Life of Tiberius Gracchus, generally considered to favor the Reform Party. And of course we have Tiberius Gracchus's land problem, as well as his land law, veto, and impeachment of Octavius, the Senate's control of foreign policy endangered, and then the Senate resorts to force overall. Now we turn to Gaius Gracchus, and the Roman New Deal continued. To an even greater degree than his older brother Gaius Gracchus labored to bring government back to the people. He was elected tribune in 124 BCE, and until he failed to be re-elected for a third term, he consistently ignored the Senate in presenting his comprehensive program of legislation before the popular assembly. When the use of legitimate but quite unethical means of